Welcome, everybody. We'll try and we are going to just let me share my screen. Okay. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming virtually to this lecture. We're going to be talking about error and harm. So in the second half of this year, we're basically on patient safety modules in the IHI Open School. And PS 101 is an introduction to the topic, and this is where we get into more detail. This is a really meaty subject, patient safety. It's a huge topic, and it's really evolved a lot over the last 20 or 30 years in terms of an idea and a concept within healthcare. Before it really took off, we kind of just accepted that healthcare was dangerous, and that if you went into hospital, there was a chance that you might not come out the way everybody wanted it to happen. But we've understood a lot more through studying, through influence from other industries, such as the airline industry, that error and harm is preventable. And with systematic approach, you can actually reduce this down to very low level indeed. So in this lecture, we're going to be talking about Swiss cheese model, types of harm, and we're also going to understand what unsafe acts are. Then there will be a little interactive video and discussion at the end as well. So this is one definition of harm. It is the unintended physical injury resulting from or contributed to by medical care that requires additional monitoring, treatment, or hospitalization that results in death. So what does this leave out? What does this definition leave out? Maybe if you could put a few suggestions in the chat. Thank you, Sharon. Near misses. Near misses are probably a warning sign of harm, but probably not actual harm. So harm is when something actually happens. Yeah. Psychological and emotional harm. Absolutely, Craig. Yeah. So, and financial as well. So there are lots of different types of harm that result, not just physical injury. Yeah, it's not mentioning anything about it being preventable, Andrea, and that's correct. Harm is preventable. So other things in this definition that we might want to do, what if the harm is actually intended? Is it or unintended? And what about omissions and misdiagnoses and you know, things that we're never going to end up in harm themselves, but through a series of problems such as missing this and missing that, the harm has occurred. We talked about different types of harm, not just physical, and what if the harm doesn't result in additional care? So harm that, you know, kind of goes by the way, we can just get by, we don't need to correct anything at all. That's still harm. So today's unpreventable events are only an innovation away from being preventable. So it's about actually, this is the mind shift that happened about 20, 30 years, is thinking, actually, we can prevent some of these things if we just think of things in a different way. For example, in the airline industry, British Airways used to call their passengers, I think they used to still call them cargo. And they didn't think of them as people, but they thought of them as units of things that they needed to shift across the world. And that sort of mindset didn't lend itself to a position of customer-centric care. And as a result, also their safety was not the number one goal in their industry. The number one goal was to ship as many of these units across the world as possible to make money. And so a huge culture change came in where it was a customer-centric care. And one of the big problems they realized was that people didn't want to fly with them because they realized that they might die. So they thought, well, this is a big problem. We've got to think of it from a customer point of view. How are we going to convince them to jump in our planes and fly across the world and not die as a result? And that's where they really focused on on customer safety. And that's why we have all these demonstrations every time we go in the plane telling us what to do in an emergency, etc. So it's changing your attitude towards it in the first place. It is the first step towards improving error and harm. So how does harm occur? Well, harm can occur from error, but it can also come from when we don't find any particular error that's happened at all. Sometimes errors can happen that don't result in any harm. And there are two types of error. There's latent conditions, which is the environment around us, which lends itself to an effect that we don't want. It's kind of like the system is producing what it's designed to do. And in order to make the system produce better results, we need to change that system. And inside that system is things like equipment and training and resources, etc. Active failures are when things are either done or not done, which lead to the error or the harm involved. So, for example, if somebody pushed the incorrect button or ignored a warning sign, would be examples of error. While the person on the front line might be the proximal cause of the adverse event, the root cause is likely to be present in the system for a long time. So it's sometimes obvious, the person who has caused the error, but in order to find out, the underlying reasons, one thing that we use in healthcare is root cause analysis, which is one of the gold standard tools to try and identify the root cause. One of the simple tools you can use during this root cause analysis is whys, is the 5 whys. So you ask a question, well, why did you do that? And they might say, oh, because I was tired. And why were you tired? Well, because I've been rostered on for 7 nights in a row. Well, why are you rostered on for 7 nights in a row? This is the way that the department can do the rostering efficiently with the less number of staff. Why do you have less number of staff? Because the budget is so. And so you get to a situation where you're understanding all the layers underneath what caused an individual to make a mistake in the first place. We probably all know the Swiss cheese model. If you know the Healthcare Quality and Safety Commission that's in Wellington, they have a logo. And if you look at it closely, it's actually a Swiss cheese model. This is where we think of each layer of cheese as a barrier of defense against harm. And some of those barriers have holes, or all of those barriers have holes in them. But harm only happens when all the holes line up and something slips through. So if one of those barrier defenses work, then the holes won't line up and you'll get what's called a near miss. It will go through a couple of holes and people might notice that, but then it will get stopped at the last defense, for example. Some of the holes are active failures and some of them are latent conditions. So if we wanted to classify errors, we could use this flow chart. It's kind of a bit complicated, actually, this chart, and I've never managed to commit it to my memory. But I guess also it's not needed to really think of errors like this all the time, unless you really are investigating a situation where you want to try and split it out into the different types. And then it becomes useful because then you are trying to think of solutions. And each type of error has probably a different type of solution. So everything's under this banner of unsafe acts, things that will maybe cause a hazard. So you have violations. That means that somebody or someone deliberately decided to go against a procedure, maybe for good reasons. Maybe they thought that it either didn't apply, or that they thought that they would get a better result by going against the grain. And this happens in healthcare because we commonly have procedures and protocols, and they're never 100% followed because patients are different. Each patient is different and the presentation is different. So then there are errors. So just a failure to, that the protocol is there, but you just forgot, or you failed to do it, or you weren't able to do it because of the resources. And then from those errors, the action either comes across, does not go as intended. So something was meaning to happen, but it didn't end up the way you wanted it, like a slip, which is an observable error of execution. So, for example, in surgery, you're trying to cut between two planes, and you don't get that quite accurately enough, and you end up damaging something else. That would be a slip. A lapse would be where there is a mental or physical sort of lapse in concentration, or just where you didn't quite do something because of your concentration, for example, and that ended up with an unintended consequence. And then actions can go as intended, but they're actually the wrong things to do in the first place. So you have a set of different options in front of you, and you choose the wrong one, and you execute it correctly, but it's the wrong thing, and therefore it ends up with the wrong outcome. For instance, when prescribing for hypertension, there is a huge selection of drugs, and the GP might choose one thinking it's the right one for the patient, but later on it doesn't reduce the blood pressure, and in retrospect it was the wrong one to choose, and there might be a good pharmacological reason underneath it all that they just did not consider at the time. So those are mistakes, and there are two types of mistakes, really. There are rule-based mistakes, so error in applying the knowledge correctly, and knowledge-based mistakes. So basically the base knowledge is wrong. So there's actually a lack of knowledge, or it's actually you've remembered something wrongly, or you've learned something wrongly, I mean. So those are all the different types of error. So let's try it for ourselves. So for these 5 error harm situations, could you decide what type of error it is? So we've got slips, lapses, mistakes, which are either due to underlying knowledge problems or not using it correctly. See if you can put something down on the chat. Okay, so each 5 is a different type. No, they're separate things, so you need to think about for each one. So Sharon's saying the first one is a lapse. So you forget to tell your patient to schedule a follow-up appointment. Sounds like a lapse to me too. We'll get the results, the answers in a minute. Craig is saying first one is a lapse. Second one is a slip. So you try to give your patient a pamphlet on a healthy eating, but grab the wrong one. Yeah, sounds like a slip. Yeah. And then the third one is a lapse. You don't wash your hands because you're distracted. Probably a lapse, yes. You don't wash your hands because you don't feel like you have time. Violation. Yeah. So that you know what the right thing to do is, but you choose not to do that. And then you misdiagnose your patient's pain as a mistake. Sounds like that's correct. Let's see what the answers are. Yeah. So lapse, slip, lapse, violation, and mistake. Thank you, everybody, for contributing. So when we're approaching error, it's really good to think of it from a systems point of view rather than an individual point of view. So we're largely focusing on the conditions under which those individual people are working. And therefore we can then design our defenses against that error based on what the system is producing rather than just individuals. Another reason why it's better to focus on systems is because our individuals change. They change all the time. If we need to keep working on each individual, we're never going to get to a point where it's an error that's not happening routinely. We need to minimize the conditions that lend themselves to violations. And we need to put mechanisms in place to mitigate the effects of unsafe acts that may inevitably occur. So yes, in healthcare, we can't get away from error altogether, but we do need to put in safety nets in place to catch patients who are developing problems from those errors and try and correct them before it becomes a bigger problem. So this is a big hot topic about blame and accountability, and I wanted to open this up for a bit of discussion. So you can either use the chat or you can unmute yourselves and contribute. Where do you think, in terms of patient safety, do you think there is, in our environment, we have ACC, we are trying to improve things from a system point of view. Is there still room for blame and accountability? You know, so individual blame and individual accountability.
I think so. I'm just going to talk. I think there definitely is room for accountability. We have to be accountable for our practice and take some responsibility. But I suppose when we're working in a system, that can be more or less.
Yep. What do you think is the downside to having some individual accountability and blame?
People not feeling comfortable about owning their mistakes.
Yeah, I think that's we have this tension all the time between having a blame-free culture, which is a phrase that was bandied around for a long time, and I don't know if we still use that. Where if we have a blame-free culture, then people will be happy to speak up and share all the problems that they've had, and this will lead us to much more easily to improve the system and reduce error. But I think a blame-free culture is, in my opinion, I think is not achievable. And also, we do need some individual accountability. And where there has been malicious acts, we need to be able to blame people. So it's a real tension. And the problem is that then if people know that there is a small possibility that they're going to get disciplinary action for speaking up, then that is a real barrier for them speaking up. And most of the time, of course, there isn't going to be much individual blame or much individual accountability for most errors that occur in the system. But there are just sometimes when that worry is there, especially in situations where the outcome has been really, really bad, like if somebody has died who shouldn't have died, for example. So this is something that organizations constantly struggle with, is how to encourage people to speak up without saying that they're completely off the hook. There is a good way to think of sort of culpability, and this is a great chart, actually. I like it a lot. On the left there is, you completely to blame for what's happened. It would be negligence. It could even be something where you would be prosecuted for, and right down to the other side where, as an individual, you really did not have anything to do with it at all. So it helps you decide this by asking a few questions like, were the actions intended? And of course, this can be quite difficult to prove sometimes. And it may take a history or a series of events before you can see a pattern developing with an individual. But if they are intended and the consequences were intended, then that is, that is criminal, basically. If the actions were not intended, were they just doing something still that was unauthorized? For example, with substance abuse, and if they weren't, were they knowingly violating safe operating procedures? And if so, was the conditions around them conducive for them to be able to follow them? So basically, the individual chose not to follow it despite being able to do it. So this is probably the cutoff point between real individual blame and systems problems. So if you had all the available resources to do the right thing and you chose not to do the right thing, then there is possible recklessness and violation. Although in medicine, again, this is probably quite a gray box, because you may have intendedly violated the procedures because you thought you were going to get a good outcome. So yeah, so then from here downwards, we're talking a lot about systems problems and very reducing amounts of culpability. So patient safety has really broadened its focus from just blaming individuals to actually looking at error and how we can reduce that to prevent harm. Active errors are signs that latent errors are present and may one day allow a hazard to slip all the way through the holes and cause harm. That's the Swiss cheese model. And system failures that lead to serious patient harm are rarely the result of just one error involving one person. Okay, they're typically a series of breakdowns and processes, a combination of problems and perfect storms. Okay, so we're going to now watch a short video here about how a zoo can help us learn about safety in healthcare. This is a good example of how we can really learn well from other industries. I mentioned before the airline industry, and now we're learning from a zoo. And there are other industries that also have lots of lessons for us. So this is really where innovation in patient safety occurs, is at the interface between two different sort of areas, sectors. So let me just put the set things up so I can get into here. And I'm just going to share the video. Oh, hang on. 1 second.
We go outside of healthcare to see our system in a new way and get fresh ideas for improvement. Today, we're going to learn about a safety system to handle a totally different hazard, one we rarely.
Sorry about that. All right. So put a thumbs up or something if you can see the YouTube. Yeah, great. Thanks. Just make this. There we go.
We go outside of healthcare to see our system in a new way and get fresh ideas for improvement. Today, we're going to learn about a safety system to handle a totally different hazard, one we rarely face in healthcare. We're going to look at dangerous snakes.
Hi, I'm Kathy Duncan, and today we're going outside of healthcare to the Central Florida Zoo.
The Central Florida Zoo has a lot to teach us about safety. Specifically, we're going to learn 3 valuable lessons about reliability. In order to create reliable systems, we need to prevent failure, identify failures and mitigate their effects, and learn from failure to better design our systems. How does the zoo apply those concepts when handling venomous snakes?
My name is Michelle Hoffman. I'm a reptile keeper at the Central Florida Zoo. I've been here for 4 years, and I work with one of the largest collections of venomous reptiles in the Southeast within AZA zoos.
Michelle took us behind the scenes to show us how they stay safe when handling snakes, to clean their enclosures and to move them.
The red and the green cage cards actually will tell us at a quick glance if the snake in the enclosure is venomous or non-venomous. So the red obviously is the venomous, the green is the non-venomous, red stop, green go.
And what's this number 1 up there?
The numbers above the enclosures actually tell the keepers how many animals are in the enclosure. So for example, there's only 1 Aruba Island rattlesnake in here, and there are 3 pythons in that enclosure. So we know if we open the door and we only see 2 animals, there might be 1 hiding somewhere, to keep your eyes open and actually find all of those animals before you reach in or before you do any work in the enclosure.
All this helps prevent snake bites. But what if a failure does occur? When keepers handle snakes, they work in pairs, so that if something goes wrong, there's a trained person there to help them.
We're expected to work really closely with our coworkers and our managers. We have a very open relationship when it comes to trust and being able to speak up.
They also use a belt clip with key information about the snake, such as the antivenom.
So that way if something goes wrong, somebody can come in from the outside, know exactly how to handle the situation and which antivenom to bring with you to the hospital.
This helps to reduce harm if a failure does occur. The next principle of reliability is that you may redesign your systems based on what you've learned from failures.
It's been over 20 years since we've had a venomous snake bite here at the Central Florida Zoo, and one of the reasons for that great track record is because we were always adapting and adjusting and learning how to improve our systems to prevent any failures in the future.
For example, they used to use a lanyard instead of the belt clip with all the snake information.
We actually switched it to the belt clip in order for it to be completely out of our way and not in any sort of position where it could get attached on anything or a snake's tail could get hooked around it or anything like that.
They also modified their trash barrel to have a plexiglass window on the top so that they could see where the snake is.
One of the main ways that we do learn is from other people, other facilities, other reptile professionals. So we are expected to have close relationships with those colleagues. If we have a system that maybe went a little bit wrong or that maybe wasn't working out the best, we can go to them and ask for advice without feeling like we're inferior or something like that.
Every time I visit the zoo, I see opportunities to standardize, mitigate failure, and even redesign the work. But they've taken opportunities to really look at how they can keep not only their keepers safe, but they can keep their animals safe. So as you go about your daily work and daily life, look at other opportunities to really see how you might can bring things back to healthcare.
Okay, so we're going to just discuss a few of the things there. So the video lists 3 principles of reliable design. How have you seen the same principles applied elsewhere in your work areas?
Grammarly can help you write quickly and confidently,
All
so
right.
you never have to slow down.
Well, it appeared like they had protocols,
Yeah, yeah. So they had protocols.
and we have protocols.
Mm-hmm. So can you give us an example of a protocol in your area?
So a protocol about how to manage a cardiac arrest.
Okay, so
So an algorithm to manage a cardiac arrest.
good. Okay, then. So that protocol, is it something that everybody in the DHB follows? Is it something that everybody in New Zealand follows? Just tell me about it a bit more, just for other people who might not be familiar with resus protocols.
So an adult cardiac arrest protocol is the one that we utilise in this organisation, is the New Zealand Resuscitation Council protocol, or procedure or guideline. And I suppose it's used, like you say, as the recipe, but the recipe might alter depending on the given situation and context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What features of the protocol sort of lend itself towards safety?
So if you follow the protocol, it encourages you to consider danger. So at the beginning of assessing a person for responsiveness, you would check for danger. And it also, I'm just thinking about how clearly it outlines, like, you know, if you were using an AED, for example, that people would need to check that they were not going to be shocked.
Yep.
But it doesn't really say that exactly. So some of it's implied.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so other things that spring to mind around that example is that we have a system based around this protocol. So it's not just a protocol that's published on a website and then we expect people to follow it. We have a huge system behind it all. So that system is a series of workshops for people to train on using this algorithm. And during these workshops, they do role playing. We have systems behind that to ensure that people go to these training things and that people are up to date. We chase people up if they've not done them, or they can't start work without going on to these courses, for example. And then when there is any times there's the change of shift, there's a handover responsibility for those cardiac arrest teams. So people are expected to familiarize themselves with the layout and stuff. So there's a huge organizational system behind a protocol like that. And that is to keep not only the staff safe in terms of, using the defibs and stuff, but also to keep the patients safe so that they don't get the wrong doses of things given to them or the wrong types of shocks and the wrong rhythms, for example, that we try and deliver the right treatment to them. So yeah, that's a great example. So I'm just reading in the chat here. Sharon, you mentioned something about peer review of cases. Are you happy to expand on that for us?
Can you hear me right?
We can just hear you, I think.
Oh, can you hear me? So one of the tests that we do is the auditory brainstem response test for babies that are being referred from the newborn hearing screening.
Sorry, I'm going to have to stop you there, Sharon, because you sound like a robot. I'm sure you'll be able to do a good dance along with that, but yeah, maybe your connection isn't quite good enough for that. But we'll move on. Red and green streams in primary care settings for COVID-19 swabbing. S. Rivet, sorry, I can't remember your first name. You want to comment on that?
Sandra,
Hi,
James.
Sandra.
Well, I probably didn't need to put COVID-19, but just in the case of COVID-19 at the moment, because, they're putting the ones who've got a cough out one side and the ones who are, unrelated potentially to symptoms of COVID-19 are going in the green stream.
That's good. So we're just instead of mixing them up and potentially cross-contaminating, we're putting people in two streams. We're giving them different colors to make it visually easy to manage these two different streams of patients.
Yeah, triaging them and potentially at the start and doing it that way.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Yeah, Peggy's mentioned we've got isolation procedures and contact precautions. Yep, and these are things we need to follow. Craig says making things easy to follow, belt clips for snake labels, healthcare, providing hand gel at locations of use, i.e. point of care. So that's a really good, simple example of improving patient safety by thinking about the environment around us and reducing the latent error and understanding human behavior. So teamwork and culture and a culture of transparency and trust are important to protecting safety. And how do you think teamwork promotes each of the principles of reliable design?
I suppose initially people come up together with a plan about how to manage an action or a behaviour or a system. And so that's quite important from the point of view of everyone getting on board.
Yeah, can you think of an example?
Well, I suppose we could think about COVID-19 and, Jacinda Ardern. Everybody's on board with being in level 4 and staying at home and following the rules. And I suppose it's being presented to us in a manner that demonstrates the teamwork involved and the necessity for everybody to do the same thing and the right thing because we're working as a team.
Yeah, I think I'm in a position where I've managed to compare the New Zealand government's response in a crisis versus the UK government response in a crisis, because I've been in both countries relatively recently, and the difference between the approaches is like night and day. One of the obvious things that I saw in the last outbreak press conferences is the transparency, and that the government are actually happy to put their hands up and say, okay, we didn't get this bit right, and we're sorry about that. In terms of like the initial managed isolation quarantine, for example, and I think that culture of transparency has maintained our trust in them, and the fact that we're able to go back into lockdown without too much opposition. I mean, there's always going to be people who say we should be doing this, but a lot of people in the rest of the world are saying we should be doing this, but it seems like everybody in New Zealand is behind the plan. So yeah, I think that's a really good example. Just on the chat there. So you all own, Sharon said you all own it and are invested in the process. Joe Oxley saying team members are able to collaborate towards the design. Joe, are you happy to expand on that a bit more from your own personal experience? I will go on. LMC1 says helps with buy-in from staff for a project to increase its success. And have you got an example there?
Hi, it's Leanne. I think stuff we've had within the ED around change proposals, whether it be we had a change for the triage area. So I think to try and get as many staff in on the project, it helps with just the success of it. I think it you can identify, you know, where any issues are, and also to try and eliminate, because some people don't do change well. So it's around sort of trying to bring everyone along on the same journey, you know, to head them in the right direction.
Yeah. That reminds me of sort of a really good concept called shared mental models. So whenever we're working within a system, there's a lot of assumed things that or goals that we're trying to work towards, you know, a shared mental model. But of course, if you don't include everybody in the discussion and sort of say, okay, this is the page that we're all trying to be on, and try and communicate that clearly, then you can't actually assume that people are trying to do the same thing. And if you don't have the same shared mental model, well, that's a recipe for errors and problems cropping up. So that's a good example. And Joe replied saying just increases buy-in and team members more able to take ownership and adhere to process and system. Okay, one more question before we wrap up. So what would happen if the zoo waited to redesign its systems until an actual failure, not just the possibility of a failure, had occurred? In your experience, are health systems more often proactive or reactive when it comes to addressing safety issues? I could probably predict what your answer is. Actually, let's do a little poll here. So I'll see if I can create a little poll. Oh no, that's going to take too long. Sorry. So maybe just in the chat, let's just see answer for the last question. Can you write proactive or reactive in terms of what you think your view is on that? Okay, so we got more reactive at times, constantly reactive, both reactive. Yeah, it's I would agree. Majority of the time, it's a reactive situation. It's firefighting. It's the common thing is, oh, they're just putting out fires all the time. Not often proactive. I suppose the only time we are proactive, I guess, is when I've seen in my department where we have a new piece of evidence come through in a journal and it interests us and we start talking about it, and then we may end up actually implementing it. So in colorectal surgery, one of our surgeons is very interested in infections and has been involved in writing papers on how to reduce that with oral antibiotic prophylaxis along with bowel prep. And it's now at the stage where there's a good amount of evidence in the literature to support it. So we've actually started to implement that with discussions with ID, and that's doing that proactively before we have discovered that our wound infection rates are higher than other people's, for example. We're just doing it because it seems to be the right thing to do. So that would be a proactive example. It's not very common. Most of the time in healthcare, especially when it comes to change, which requires a lot of effort, it requires a bad news story for anything to get into gear. And then And then it's sad that it has to be like that, I guess. Does anybody else have examples of in their area where there was a reactive change that may ended up with a good change in the end? Oh, well, it's okay. Yeah, it would be great if our systems was able to be more proactive. Does anybody know what probably our DHB-wide system is for collecting information to act on it proactively? Does anybody know what that system is?
Well, we use safety first, but that sort of seems reactive.
So if used with enough resource and properly, safety first is the system for proactive improvement. Through the safety first, you should be able to collect data on near misses, which somebody mentioned right at the beginning. And near misses are the red flags, are the ways in which we can be proactive about something before it happens. Of course, we're so under-resourced that anything in safety first that is not either resulting in patient death or permanent disability doesn't really get investigated on an individual basis. And I don't see much coming out in terms of analysis of aggregate data on the near misses to see if there's trends that we can intervene with. I don't think there's any resource behind that. So yeah, safety first is our system. Okay, so it's now 7 minutes to 1, so it's probably time to wrap things up. Just before we go, are there any questions or any comments before I leave you with one final thing? Okay, so there is one video that I've managed to dig out from my past, which I'm going to put a link in the chat to now. You might want to click on it or copy it before this Zoom ends. And it's a link to a video that was produced by the NHS in 2003, which is actually quite a long time ago now. And so back then it was actually introducing ideas that we've been talking about today that were really very new back then, about the administration of intrathecal chemotherapy, and is based around a very tragic case. And there's some great examples of systems all combining together to end up with a really terrible harm. So it's a really good example. It's about a 40-minute video. It's really well put together. It's well worth watching, and it's a great teaching aid as well if you're teaching anybody else about the concepts of safety. So I will leave you with that. Thank you very much for joining me, and have a good Friday and the weekend. Cheerio.